Hi, this is Kevin Lin from Illuminate LSAT, and this is a presentation on two views in a logical reasoning stimulus. In particular, I want to focus on what happens when the second view looks like it's countering or challenging in some way something that the first view said. We'll talk about how you should approach this situation and what you should keep in mind. So the first thing that we need to understand is what exactly happens to an argument when you counter one of its premises or assumptions. So let's take a look at this argument here. Most dentists recommend using the toothpaste brand Teeth Bright. Therefore, Teeth Bright must be the most effective toothpaste. Whenever we have an argument, let's go ahead and break it down into premise and conclusion structure. And so I've done that over here. P for premise, most dentists recommend Teeth Bright. Conclusion, meaning the author of this argument thinks that this premise proves this conclusion that Teeth Bright must be the most effective toothpaste. And is this argument making an assumption? And of course it is, because this premise does not automatically prove this conclusion. We have no idea why these dentists are recommending Teeth Bright. Does their recommendation actually mean that it's the most effective? This argument is assuming that the toothpaste most dentists recommend is the most effective toothpaste. And just in case you're unfamiliar with this notation, I put a parenthesis around this assumption just to signify that it was not explicitly stated in the argument. It's something that is implicit. So let's say it turns out that this premise is actually incorrect. That, you know what, most dentists, they don't recommend using the toothpaste brand Teeth Bright. They actually recommend using the toothpaste brand Sparkle Smile. What happens if this premise is false? Does that allow us to then say that Teeth Bright must not be the most effective toothpaste? In other words, does proving a premise false prove that the conclusion is false? Well, even if this premise is wrong, couldn't it still be possible that Teeth Bright is the best? Even if all dentists actually recommend something else, and this argument had the premise wrong, couldn't it still be the case that Teeth Bright is the most effective? Maybe if you do a bunch of tests comparing Teeth Bright to every other toothpaste brand out there, it's going to be the most effective. So just because the author of this argument believed that this premise proved the conclusion does not mean that if this premise is wrong, the conclusion has to be wrong. That's the first important principle that you have to understand. A false premise does not prove a false conclusion. Countering someone's premise does not mean that you have countered the truth of their conclusion. But let's say it turns out that this premise is actually true. Most dentists do in fact recommend using the brand Teeth Bright. But what if we learn that this assumption actually is not true? That, you know what? The fact that dentists are recommending a particular brand does not mean it's the most effective, because maybe Teeth Bright was paying them off, and so their recommendation was based on something besides the effectiveness of the toothpaste. If it turns out that this assumption is not correct, does that prove that Teeth Bright is no longer the most effective, that it's not actually the best? Well, isn't it possible that even if the dentists are being paid off in some corrupt scheme by Teeth Bright, it just so happens to be the case that Teeth Bright is in fact the best? Maybe the brand knows that it's the best and so is paying dentists to tell people that it's the best because they just want that fact out there, that it is the best. So just because an argument happens to be making an assumption that may turn out to be wrong does not mean that their conclusion is wrong. If you disprove their assumption, that does not disprove their conclusion. That's the second important point to keep in mind right now. Now make sure that you keep these ideas in mind when you're doing logical reasoning, because the LSAT will actually test you on these quite often. And they can test you on this in many different ways. For example, they might bring up the issue in a disagree question, or sometimes called a point at issue question. Here we're being asked what the parent and the child are committed to disagreeing about. And by the way, I've only written two answer choices here because I'm trying to highlight how the LSAT would write a trap answer and how they would write the correct answer. The parent here is giving us the argument that we're familiar with. Most dentists recommend this toothpaste brand, therefore it's gotta be the most effective toothpaste. And now the child responds, haven't you heard? Teeth Bright is known to make massive payoffs to dentists and other tooth professionals in order to get them to promote Teeth Bright products. Now, do you notice that this kid is not actually contradicting the parent's premise? In fact, the child seems to potentially acknowledge and agree that most dentists might recommend this brand. We don't know exactly what the child thinks, but we do know that the child is countering the parent's assumption. This kid is pointing out that the fact dentists recommend Teeth Bright toothpaste is not a reliable indicator of its effectiveness because there's this other motive in recommending it. So let's see, what do they disagree about? Do they disagree that Teeth Bright is the most effective toothpaste? Well, clearly the parent believes it is, but can we say that the child does not believe it's the most effective toothpaste? We actually cannot say that because all the child was doing was contradicting the parent's assumption. The kid did not go ahead and say, and therefore it's not the most effective. Maybe the kid actually does believe that it's the most effective, but just disagrees with the logic of the parent's argument. And so this is how the LSAT would write a typical trap answer in this situation. Someone who doesn't really understand that countering an assumption does not counter the conclusion might fall for this pretty easily. But they do disagree over this statement because the parent clearly thinks the recommendation indicates its effectiveness, whereas the child is pointing out, no, there was another reason for the recommendation, so you can't rely on the recommendation as an indication of the effectiveness of Teeth Bright toothpaste. Here's another way that the LSAT will test the exact same concept. The question is asking us which of the following most logically completes this argument. So the stimulus starts off with some people's argument, and it's that one we're familiar with, that since most dentists make this recommendation, that means Teeth Bright has to be the most effective. That's what some people are arguing. The author comes in and says, however, Teeth Bright is known to make these payoffs. And so the author here is challenging the assumption that these people are making in their argument. All right. Now, what would be a logical conclusion? Would a logical conclusion be, therefore, Teeth Bright is not the most effective toothpaste? And of course it would not. It is the exact same flaw that you would have been making if you picked answer choice A in the previous problem. Just because the author of this argument is taking issue with the assumption of these people does not mean that they believe what answer choice A says. Maybe this brand is still the best when it comes to toothpaste, but it's just that this particular argument is not a good one in support of that idea. Now, what would make sense to add in this blank as a conclusion is the fact that most dentists recommend Teeth Bright toothpaste. That's a tongue twister, say that 10 times fast. Teeth Bright toothpaste is not a good reason to believe it's the most effective. That's the exact point here. These people were making an assumption, that assumption was wrong, and so their premise does not actually support their conclusion. That's what B is saying. Here is yet another way that the LSAT will test the exact same idea that falsifying a premise or assumption does not falsify the conclusion. The prompt says each of the following describes a flaw in the argument's reasoning except, and I'll go ahead and just highlight the except so we don't forget about that. That means that the correct answer is not going to be something wrong with the argument, and the wrong answers will be describing a flaw. So the stimulus starts off with that view that we're familiar with. Some people are arguing that since the dentists are recommending Teeth Bright toothpaste, that it's got to be the most effective. And so notice that this is their premise, since, and then their conclusion is that Teeth Bright is the most effective. The author comes in and says, however, that view, this first view, is making an assumption that the recommendation is a reliable indicator of effectiveness. The author continues and points out that that assumption is questionable because this company is just making a bunch of payoffs. We have no idea why these tooth professionals, like dentists, are making this recommendation. Now, everything up until now has been a totally fine way to respond to the first view. But do you notice that this author makes the terrible error that we are not going to make? This author thinks that proving the first view's assumption wrong or questionable means that their conclusion has to be wrong as well. That's why they say, thus, the most effective toothpaste is something besides Teeth Bright. But that is the flaw, because proving someone's assumption wrong does not mean that their conclusion is wrong. So because this is an accept question, let's look for two answers that are describing what is wrong with this argument. A says that this argument bases its conclusion on the grounds that an opposing argument is weak. And that is a flaw in this question, which is why I'm going to cross it out. But just to make things clear, I'm going to write, this is a flaw in the argument. Now, you're probably not familiar with how this language actually matches up to the flaw. This is how the LSAT, or at least one way the LSAT describes this type of flaw. The author here reached this conclusion at the end. And this conclusion is based on the fact that the first view's argument was weak. It was weak because it was making an assumption that was questionable. What about answer choice B? Does the author's argument here, does it repudiate a claim merely on the grounds that an inadequate argument has been given for it? And yes, it actually does, because this is an accept question, of course, that makes this wrong. But to be clear, I'm going to write this is a flaw in the argument. So how does answer choice B work? Well, the author is repudiating the view that Teeth Bright is the best toothpaste. And they're doing that because the argument in support of that view was making an assumption that was questionable. In other words, there was an inadequate argument. The other person's argument was not good, and therefore their conclusion is wrong. I'm repudiating your conclusion. That is not a good way of reasoning, and that's why answer choice B does describe this flaw. What about answer choice C? Did the author's reasoning here take for granted, or in other words, assume that disproving a premise disproves the conclusion it supports? Now, this is so close because the author's argument here was taking issue with something in the first view, but it wasn't taking issue with the premise. The other view's premise was that the dentists are recommending this brand. The author did not say that that was wrong. And so this part, disproving a premise, does not accurately describe what the author did. The author was actually assuming that disproving or questioning an assumption disproves the conclusion it supports. And because this is an accept question, that makes C correct, because C is not accurately describing the flaw in this argument. Answer choices A and B are describing flaws in this argument. Notice that in order to understand why answer choice C does not actually describe a flaw in this argument, in order to do that, we have to be really precise and break down the first person's view. And that's what I want to go into next. Whenever you have two views in an LR stimulus, it's important to break both of those views down. But I want to emphasize that it's important to break down the first person's view, because usually if we're practiced at logical reasoning, we're in the habit of breaking down the author's view, the second view, but we don't always take the time that we need to with the first view. Now on this page, I'm reminding you that you might have two views presented in a single paragraph like this, and that we really should not be approaching analysis of this paragraph differently from the way that we would analyze a dialogue like this. What often happens with students is that when the stimulus gives them two people with names who are standing off in a debate, it's a little bit easier to see that there are two views. Here, Fran is saying Randall's the most qualified, and Ernest saying, no, that's not true. He's not the most qualified because he doesn't have as much experience in public office as his opponent. But can you see that this stimulus here is essentially exactly the same? It's presenting a first view. Some people think that Randall's the most qualified, and then the author is coming in here with Ernest's view. However, this is wrong. He doesn't have as much experience in public office as his opponent. We should not be approaching these two stimuluses differently because they are each presenting two views, and we have to break down both of those views. One of the things we should be doing when we have two views is making sure that we determine whether the first view is actually presenting an argument. And of course, we should also do that with the second view, but I'm emphasizing the first view here because that's the one that students often overlook. So let's compare these two examples. Do you notice that in the first example here, the first view of these people here is not supported by a premise? These people think Randall's the most qualified, but we're not told why they think that. Because every argument needs to have both a conclusion and a premise, that means that this first view here is not an argument. But in the second example, we're told some people believe that since Randall has experience successfully running a large private company, therefore he must be the most qualified candidate for mayor. Here we have these people's premise in support of their conclusion, and that is why we can call this first view an argument. So over here, I've taken that example and put it on the left because I want to show you on the right how you might want to be breaking down this stimulus. We start off with the first view that I've broken into premise and conclusion. And this is something that I actually would encourage you to do, and I personally do whenever I see that there is a first view. If there is an argument, let's go ahead and break it down, and let's actually do that before we even get to the second view so we can understand the first argument better. Only once we've broken down that first argument should we turn to the second argument, and here's the author coming in with their premise and their conclusion. This is an example of the precision that is necessary in order to really excel at logical reasoning. We should not be viewing this stimulus as one undifferentiated mass of sentences. We should be dissecting it as we read into the different views' component parts. So make sure you practice this process whenever you have two views in logical reasoning. So here's a recap of what I hope you're taking away. Remember, first, disproving a premise or an assumption does not disprove the conclusion of that argument. It's still theoretically possible that the conclusion's correct, even if the argument given in support was not a very good one. The next point is make sure you always break down the first view into its premise conclusion structure if it has one. Many times they don't have one, but if they do, you gotta break it down. And of course, you also have to do it for the second view or the author's view, but I'm emphasizing the first view here because that's something that students often overlook. And if the second view challenges the first view, try to get as specific as you can about what elements it challenges. That's what the LSAT is really interested in when they present this situation. Can we really see the component parts of the first view, and can we understand how exactly the second view is responding?